Hi there. This afternoon I'd like to talk to you about the gathering storm. Now, what do I mean by the gathering storm? I mean the possibility of civil war erupting in the United States of America. Now, what do I mean by civil war? I do not mean formal armies with uniforms and battle lines and trenches and stuff like that, not at all. I mean so much anarchic behavior that governance becomes, if not impossible, extremely difficult at the federal level and increasingly difficult at the individual state level. So a general breakdown of law and order and an outbreak of violent conflict in a completely haphazard, almost anarchic sort of way. That's what I mean by a civil war. And let me get another thing completely straight at the beginning. I'm not predicting that it will happen, but I see signs of a gathering storm that it might happen, and the probability of it happening might become stronger and stronger and stronger. So I'm going to organize it to start with around three ideas: motive, means, and opportunity. Motive, what makes people do it? And by do it, of course, I mean violent conflict, to reject law and order. By and large, at the moment in America, an incredible number of groups of people see the governance structures as not relevant or legitimate to them. They refuse to accept elections. They refuse to accept public health advice. What makes them do that? In the motive section here, in the very center, I've highlighted a very unimaginative but extraordinarily important report that has just been published by the United Nations Development Programme about a multi-country survey throughout Africa. What makes young Africans join revolutionary groups, including particularly Islamic groups, but not exclusively Islamic groups? Why do they do it? One of the things that I want to say from the very beginning of this motivation, there is a general underlying motivation, and it's poverty. It's not religion, it's not politics, it's not ideology, it's poverty. And that is the single unifying factor that is named by people who join groups from all across Africa. And I believe, because of my experience peacekeeping, that it's common throughout. Where people join a group, it is to do with their terrible economic circumstances, and for 5% of them it's ideological or religious or whatever. I'm not saying there's no ideological or religious background motivation, but poverty is the big driver, and that's the reality of that. Let's have a look at some of these groups that we've got on this slide. We've got Black Lives Matter. Well, Black lives really do matter. When you're about 15% of the population and you have 70% of the prison population, there's a problem, and Black Lives Matter. Pro-life is here. I could have just as easily put up a little picture, a little thumbnail in there of anti-abortion. There are a small number of extremely zealous people who support pro-life and who support anti-abortion, and who've already shown certain violent tendencies with what they've done with their protests. We have another little thumbnail there of a bunch of immigrants who've been caught crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. These are not all Mexicans. These are every Central American country has contributed people that try and cross through Mexico into the United States. They are driven by poverty. They are driven by desperate circumstances back home. The drug guy with his white, I think he's actually a policeman, but he's a drug guy. He's in the war on drugs. And that's meant not to be about drugs. It's about money. It's about greed. Drugs are a symptom for the illegal use of anything. People traffickers, drug traffickers, any kind of traffickers, increasingly cyber traffickers. And at the bottom we've got a gun logo, because that motivator, it's actually not about the tribal issue of guns. It's about fear. It's about fear of others. It's about bigotry. If I'm scared of you, an other group, and I feel I have to arm myself against you, it is my fear that's driving me. And of course, this fear is capitalized on. Again, the economic driver is extremely important. There are really big economic interests in the whole armaments situation. Particularly the exemplar of this is America, but there is no country that is not affected by this now. We are really, really in trouble with respect to that. So the summary of motive. The motives are underpinned everywhere by poverty, but they are not exclusively poverty, because 5% are the traditional ideological and religious. There is a new element, and it's kind of difficult for me to get into this because I never met it in the field, but I've read about it, and I've read about it enough that I have to mention it. Okay, let me introduce this element, not from American experience at all, but from an experience in Kabul, Afghanistan. I was one night in the UN compound behind the huge thick walls, very well protected by armed Gurkha patrols. And I was talking with an American-Afghan, an Afghan-American, who was my age and who had been 30-something years in growing up in Afghanistan and 30-something years in America, and his last 10, 15 years he'd been shuttling between the two, trying to sort out some family issues, particularly property. He was very well connected. He was what you would call a bit of an aristocrat within certain societies, and very well educated. And we were talking, we were shooting the breeze. We had had a couple of beers, and I was talking to him about the violence and how it seemed to have a special edge in Afghanistan, and what did he think caused it. And he just leaned across the table to me, and he put his hand on my forearm, and he said, "Graham, you will never understand the role that sexual frustration plays here in this country." I thought he was having me on. I really didn't. Of all the things I expected, I didn't expect that. And I put it away. I just put it at the back of my mind because he's such a nice guy, and I didn't really know how to handle it. So let me now come back to the situation in America. I've read about a phenomenon known as incel, involuntary celibacy. I've seen statistics that say that in the 17 to 34-year-old age group, 30% of young men consider themselves to be involuntarily celibate, and almost 20% of young women. Now, they have different issues with respect to this involuntary celibacy, but seems to me the fundamental underlying issue there is they don't feel they measure up to some kind of body shape or lifestyle or possibility. They see themselves committed to, entry-level jobs forever. They are and they will never get the men will never get a girl. The girls, are chasing their sort of thing. They see themselves forced into a very frustrating involuntary celibacy at a time in their lives when, to be brutally honest, they should really be out chasing each other around the streets, and most of them ending up in happy situations. The fact of this incel and the fact of this insight with respect to sexual frustration in Afghanistan, I have never met this out in the field in my peacekeeping, but I have to take it seriously as a motivation. Are school shootings in America and things like that, mass shootings in America, partially motivated by incel? It's a dangerous condition, and if it grows, it will be more dangerous. If it passes, it's just a fad, then they will have dodged a bullet. So that really, it's a tour d'horizon, an impressionist tour d'horizon of the motivation side of the problems coming for America. Part 2, means. How and with what do people do it? And again, I'm using this expression, do it, meaning this whole panoply of actions which, taken together, look like violent conflict. The means. I want to lead off with the means, which is very difficult. Cyber. Cyber enables. Cyber fans flames. Cyber means that the crazy voices have a megaphone way out of all proportion to what they've had before. We have always, I believe, had crazy messianic people wandering the globe, collecting a small group of followers, going to the top of the mountain and waiting for doomsday. This has been with us since before biblical times. What happens now is that within 5 minutes, they can have 200 or 300 followers on some insane website, and the more followers they get, the more the website grows. And some of the websites advocating intolerance, bigotry, civil disobedience are shocking in what they say and what they teach people, or what they facilitate people in learning how to do. So the cyber element is quite new. It's very much in America. And again, at the moment, it's possibly a secondary contributing factor. But if it keeps growing, if it's unchecked, it's a primary factor. And checking it is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do if your constitution guarantees you an absolutist interpretation of the right to free speech. And I would like to put the question to you, actually, is absolute free speech a good thing for us as a species? Homo sapiens as a species, we are collective animals from the earliest times. All our early fossil records show small groups of hunter-gatherers. We are a social animal. Therefore, unrestricted free speech, which assumes that we are a single person living in a cave on the side of a hill and shouting at the masses below, is simply a wrong assumption about how we behave. I put that to you. I don't put that as an answer. Here, with the means, the very obvious means are the extraordinary number of weapons available in American society to individuals. The latest data I have seen tell us that there are more and more personal weapons, both long barrel and short barrel, out there, but in the hands of a smaller number of people. There are families across the middle class in every part of America who are rejecting the idea that they need a gun in the house to be safe. Tragically, the total number of guns out there is way bigger than it used to be, and it means that there are hordes of guns. And this is just one guy who's on the internet showing his personal selection of guns. It is inconceivable to me that a man would need that many long barrel and short barrel weapons for sport or self-defense. It is just, it's inexplicable to me. The means, income distribution, and this is a counterfactual, if you like. We have more poor people and a tiny number of extraordinarily rich people over the last 20 years. We have hundreds now of billionaires and an increasing number of people who can't make basic payroll issues in their life. And what does that mean? Well, we've talked, and I've talked about powerful patrons. And in every civil war, every violent conflict tends to have powerful patrons outside the area of the civil war. Now, if you have a civil war that's contained entirely organically within your society, who could those powerful patrons be? Are any of these new billionaires supporting websites, issues that are antisocial? I think some of them may be. And I'm not just talking about right-wing stuff here. I'm talking about crackpot stuff. Are there any crackpot billionaires? Do we have people with so much money and spare time that when they see an international team trying to rescue kids from a cave in Thailand, that they get on their social media platform and call the rescuer a paedophile, just because they can, because they know that if they get into trouble that they can buy their way out of it. It's not the obvious, it's not people who have an evil intent and who will fund the evil intent. It's people who use the world as a plaything because they can, and that inadvertently has the secondary effect of funding untoward activity, illegal activity, violent activity, encouraging violent activity that they didn't necessarily have as a primary objective. It's just a secondary or even tertiary effect of what they do. So there are economic drivers to this, and they're not direct. These are not foreign governments trying to destabilize countries. If I was a political advisor to a foreign government that was considering itself antagonistic towards the United States of America, I'd say, look, boss, 10, 15 years back, we were funding a pretty serious, program of just trying to introduce friction into their governance systems. But you know what? They seem to be doing a pretty good job of that themselves now. We now can be very, very bespoke, very, very focused. If we want to delay them, we can actually start targeting their scientific programs to just delay their discoveries so that we get to the market first. That's all we need to do. Sometimes we're just buying a small economic advantage. We don't have to have massive combat with respect to us and them. We just need to be able to pick our own points of interest, because they're doing a tremendous job of making themselves dysfunctional. That's what I would do. And the final part of the means for the United States, which causes me genuine distress, is this issue where the court system, the election system, this, by the way, is a thumbnail of the current American Supreme Court. The court system, the election system, is losing legitimacy by overt politicization. Now, it is true that we are social animals. We live by political ideas and political leaders. There was, however, until recently, the idea of a contract between leaders and led, so that the leaders would think twice and cut once, that the leaders would recognize that they wouldn't lead forever and that space must be left for opposing points of view. Respect must be built for opposing points of view. And in the currently politicized climate, we have rampant reorganization of electoral boundaries to emasculate your opposition and support yourself with change boundaries for election districts. We have courts that are overturning long-established civil liberties in order to feed certain, let us say, more hard-line, more, people often say right-wing, but I'm just going to say intolerant points of view with respect to tolerating those who we don't particularly like, we don't particularly want to have supper with, but we know that they must be allowed their voice. We know that they must be allowed to do what they want to do. And the perversion of the means of justice in the courts and the electoral system is extraordinarily dangerous and has never been more delicately poised in US history. So that basically brings me to the roundup of the means of how a civil war could be facilitated. Opportunity. The incidents and enablers that spark and facilitate these individual flare-ups, which when summed together constitute a form of civil war, civil unrest, civil disobedience. In this opportunity slide, I have a thumbnail of anti-vaxxers. The COVID epidemic, the requirement, a sensible requirement of public health authorities to say, irrespective of your personal convenience, we need to vaccinate the entire population in order to stamp this pandemic out. And the anti-vaxxers, fed by certain complete disinformation websites, were a small, highly vocal group who never represented even 10% of the total population. I think 10% may have had reasonable doubts about various bits and pieces, but went along with the vaccination. It's the people who, for entirely unscientific reasons, refused vaccination, who remained a little pocket of potential infection. They were like a small, scattered little incubators of infection scattered through society. So the rest of us put up with the issues of lockdown and the issues of caused, you know them well enough, of COVID. And the anti-vaxxers, if you like, spat at us. They spat in our face. And it was all sparked by the requirement of the central governments across Europe, North America, and as far as I've read in many, many countries, a tiny number wanted to defy the authority of the central government for all sorts of reasons and went ahead and did it. But the opportunity that sparked it was the ability to say no in a time of crisis when everybody was a bit scared. The young lady saying, "I can't breathe," this is police brutality. This is the opportunity that comes every time the police overreact completely disproportionately, sometimes causing death. And what that does is that feeds the forces that are rumbling and mumbling and grumbling about various things in society. It was the same reason why inevitably, eventually, you would have to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Because for the few hundred you had in there, you inspired a few thousand outside. And you can kill the head of a terrorist group, and for some months, whilst there's a power struggle going on, that group will be headless. But the next leader will be stronger simply because he'll be able to wear the mantle of the martyred former leader. It is not a good thing to spark outrage by overreaction, particularly by forces of law and order. It's one thing to have a bad experience down at the tax office where you're told you can't tax your car today, you've got to come back on Monday. It's another thing for a group of police officers to jump on you so that you cannot breathe. And so that's the kind of thing that really is a bona fide opportunity, a bona fide spark point for these kind of things. Say no to fracking. I'm deliberately jumping around the horizon of all these potential flashpoints so that you get the idea. It will not be one individual thing. It will be a bunch of things that all come together at the same time and synergistically cause the problem. And it's like a nuclear reaction. Once you get critical mass and you start having the nuclear reaction self-sustaining, that is the issue that I'm talking about. Say no to fracking. There's all sorts of reasons why fossil fuels are both a curse and the drug that we are hooked on at the moment. There is no point in saying tomorrow we stop 100% all fossil fuels. Our society won't survive it. We are hooked on that drug. A sensible way of weaning ourselves off that drug would be entirely open to any normal political process. But political processes that are highly polarized, that are intolerant, that not just intolerant themselves, but encourage intolerance in other small groups, that's a whole different story. The indigenous rights movements, you cannot possibly think that indigenous peoples throughout the Americas have been given a fair shot. That written contracts, written treaties that were made with them weren't broken in a certain rush to industrialize, rush to economically exploit. We have absolutely, in North America, we have absolutely misbehaved with respect to indigenous rights and indigenous resources. And it's an extremely important issue, but it comes together at a time when the environment is also an extremely important issue. And you're seeing the start of a confluence here. People who weren't even slightly concerned about indigenous rights 20 years ago are much more concerned when indigenous rights overlap with economic issues, overlap with ecological issues, and all of a sudden we have a different kind of potential coalition. The opportunity to exploit all sorts of things like that is there and is growing. We have in the top left little picture the mass shootings in schools. And I'm put in mind late in the last century there was a vigilante that was on the New York subway who got just tired of previous treatment, and he carried a gun and he waited to find 4 young black men who were roughhousing around or whatever, and he shot 3 of them. He shot all of them, causing terrible damage. And he just said, I'd had enough. I think that the issue of mass shootings is tragic. Every single family that survives a mass shooting is tragic. But the issue here is that if we have enough of these opportunities of mass shootings, at some point we are also going to have a vigilante backlash. And that is the crossover point. We need to stop the shootings so we never get to the crossover point. This would be my case. Now, there isn't a mass shooting that I'm aware of where the shooter has gone along with just one weapon. There are always weapons and ammunition to spare. The idea is to cause mass havoc. And this, to me, speaks to an issue with respect to gun control, to needing to look at who can get a gun and under what conditions they can carry it. Those are my first 3 parts. Now my 4th and final part Part 4. What are the key lessons from the Golden Age, and how do I use the Cynefin analysis to look at the key factor and to help give some guidance as to what could be done with what I consider to be the key factor? Spoiler alert, the key factor is going to be law and order. The key factors that I've talked about, key lessons rather, from the Golden Age of peacekeeping. Powerful patrons. You cannot get away from this. In the international sphere, big countries that foment and support insurrection and civil war in smaller countries, either close to them or ideologically close to them. The issue there with the powerful patrons is that the structure of peace comes from the outside. The architecture of peace is set on the outside. But the legitimacy and the actual building of the actual peace comes from the inside. And the reason why I stress this is even if we get millions of people to all hold hands in the street and to give flowers to each other and to say I love you every morning when they get up, and that's brilliant and it's very human and it's excellent, I'm not making fun of that, without the structure, without the architecture from the top down, those millions will just be millions of casualties. We need both. We need top down and bottom up, and different people will work on it, because some of the top down architects aren't necessarily very pleasant people that you would want one of your family to date, and some of the bottom ups are wonderful people, hopelessly idealistic, and you don't want them organizing a bus schedule to get your kids to school. So we need both top down and bottom up. The post-conflict regime of law and order. If we offered a similar police reform to African Americans, the police reform similar to in scope and intent that we had in El Salvador, you would get real take-up from the African American community. Everybody in the new police had to be human rights vetted, both the existing and the new entrants, which came from the guerrilla forces, the guys who've been fighting the government for the last 16 years. Nobody who couldn't pass the human rights vetting was allowed in. Now, the idea of defunding American police forces, I understand the rage and the anger that calls for that. The day after you've defunded the police, I'll tell you what it'll look like. Even worse than it did the day before. You think it was bad with law and order before? Try anarchic law and order. You have got to have, every society needs some form of constabulary function, some form of police function. You can't do without it, and therefore it must contain all elements. There must be much more genuine involvement, even of people who you think are antisocial, who you don't really like. Believe me, over the peace process in El Salvador, for 2 years, we watched government negotiators and FMLN negotiators who couldn't stand to be in the same room as each other to start with, eventually hammering out a police deal. You have to do everyone must have a stake in the new law and order, or they just become outsiders again. They become the new rebels, they become the new liberation army. You've got to keep everybody in, or their representatives, unless they fail human rights vetting. Okay. Reconciliation is more important than the economy. I saw in Bosnia the desire to create jobs, before there was rights, and justice. And we then had the same old criminals or their proxies running the same old communities, and nothing changed. And the reason why Bosnia is in the shape that it's in at the moment is partly due to the maps and partly due to the rush to mend the economy before they had mended the social structure. Without reconciliation, without you don't have to get groups to love each other. You have to get them to tolerate each other. And without tolerance, and without the seen as impartial or at least even-handed system of law and order, it is not going to work. Reconciliation is way more important than economics. They didn't have an economy during the war they were fighting in Bosnia, and they didn't have it a week after it had ended. Of course they shouted loudly that they wanted it. But what they really needed was law and order to run the thing. Finally, the non-kinetic action, because it is important, is essential in the legitimacy building process. The non-kinetic action of witness and accompaniment in the bottom up is the sort of thing that outsiders and persons of good faith from outside can provide all the time. They do the witness and accompaniment. It's vital. It cannot build the peace from the top down, but it certainly fills out the structure that's given from the top down so that it's a just and legitimate structure. And now the final part, because I've stressed time and time again, I've come back to law and order reform, and I've got to show a bit of a path out. I just want to leave you with this idea. The obvious domain is the most obvious thing in the obvious domain is written law. If you need a new constitution for a new area, if you need a new set of civic rules, the average university law department will knock that out for you in 72 hours. Written law is simple. Legitimate written law, that's another story, because it has to be vetted and accepted by ordinary people. But the actual written law, the black letter law, that's not the trouble. And those institutions that have made it their job to delay for 3, 4, 5 years the production of written law are hoodwinking you. The complicated domain, the biggest single factor in the complicated domain, is law enforcement, because it requires experience, training, and judgment. You cannot just take black letter law and hammer it with nails on the street. You've got to have experience, you've got to have judgment, you've got to be able to pass routine and repeated human rights and civil rights vetting. Missing at the moment. It's like saying to people, you can run a business and the first time you set it up, we'll make you pass decent accountancy practice, but after that you're on your own. You just report if you do anything fraudulent with your accounts and your books. Really? Okay, that's enforcing the law. Legitimacy. Legitimacy is essential and very difficult to grip. One person's legitimacy is another person's starting point. That's not the point. The point is that you need the adaptive social interactions whereby every sector of society feels it's had its say, that its voice has been heard, that respect has been shown to it, and that if they have a problem with an aspect of a certain piece of written law, that it has been amended by the legislators to take in that particular complaint. It is never perfect. It's always a work in progress. And without legitimacy, you have people withdrawing their support to be governed, withdrawing their consent to be governed. When you have people withdrawing their consent to be governed, it is a civil war situation. So the magic comes from the complex sector with emergent practice, complicated practice with its enforcing the law, good practice, and best practice is written law. And the whole point of this has been to try and avoid that fourth domain, chaotic. Given the ability of modern weapons, we do not need to see a mass chaotic event, anarchic event in American society. So, with that, I'm going to leave you to your thoughts and we'll enjoy a question and answer session as required. Thank you.